There are winters that seem to hold their breath. Winters so quiet that the sky feels like glass, and the air itself seems afraid to move. That was how November of 1930 began in the remote northern stretch of what was then the Northwest Territories. A land of frozen rivers, sleeping pines, and a silence so pure it could unnerve a man. To the south, trappers and traders spoke often of Anjikuni, a small Inuit settlement resting by a long, frozen lake. It was a village known for its hospitality, for fires that burned late into the night, and for the way its people always welcomed strangers with broth and stories. In the long months when the rest of the wilderness felt indifferent, Anjikuni felt human. That's what made what happened there so impossible to believe. The first man to notice something was wrong was a trapper named Joe Labelle. He wasn't famous, nor particularly superstitious. Just a man who had spent too many winters listening to the sound of his own heartbeat in the wild. He knew the paths by instinct, the way rivers curved and winds carried sound. He'd passed through Anjikuni before, and the memory of its laughter, the chatter of children, the rhythm of sled dogs, lingered in his mind like the smell of smoke after a fire. That evening, snow had already begun to fall. A cold, steady snow that blurred the horizon and muted the world. Labelle's boots crunched through the crusted drifts as he made his way toward the lake. He expected the usual, the faint glow of oil lamps, a curl of smoke above the huts, the smell of cooked seal or fish carried on the air. But as he neared, he saw none of it. No smoke, no sound, no movement. At first, he thought he'd simply arrived too late, that everyone was asleep. Yet as he came closer, the silence pressed down heavier, too heavy for a place that had once pulsed with life. He called out once, a cautious, "Hello!" his voice catching on the stillness. Nothing answered, not even the dogs. He found the first sled team near the edge of the village. 6 dogs, frozen stiff in their harnesses, eyes wide as if startled by something unseen. They had not been scavenged by wolves or ravens, which in that wilderness was strange enough. It meant the bodies had frozen quickly, preserved in the brutal cold before decay could begin. Labelle's breath came in clouds. He approached the nearest igloo and knocked on the frame, calling again. No reply. He pushed the flap aside and stepped in. Inside, the small dwelling was neat, too neat. Bedding was laid out. A pot rested beside the hearth, filled with frozen stew. It looked as though someone had stepped out only minutes before, expecting to return. But no footprints led away. He went from one igloo to another, each the same. Beds unrolled, lamps cold, food untouched. A rifle leaned against a wall, loaded. Tools lay where they had been dropped. The villagers had not packed. They had not prepared. They had simply gone. By the time Labelle reached the last dwelling, his hands were shaking. He wasn't sure whether it was from cold or fear. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no broken walls. Only that suffocating stillness. He tried to tell himself they had migrated, gone hunting perhaps, or moved to higher ground. But migration left traces, tracks, sled marks, signs of preparation. Here there was none. He stepped outside again and turned toward the lake. The moon hung above it like a shard of bone. The snow had stopped falling, but the air felt heavier than before, thick, listening. He whispered aloud, though no one was there to hear him. "What happened to you?" By dawn, Labelle had reached a telegraph cabin used by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police patrols. The officers stationed there later described him as ashen, near trembling, and convinced he had seen a thing not meant for men to see. He told them everything: the frozen dogs, the empty dwellings, the food left half-cooked. The Mounties, skeptical but intrigued, organized a small team to travel north with him. The journey took 2 days through knee-deep snow and unrelenting wind. When they arrived, they found the same haunting emptiness Labelle had described, though now, under the clear winter sun, it looked even more surreal. The igloos were intact. Supplies still hung from hooks. Fire pits sat cold, surrounded by undisturbed snow. Not a footprint in sight. They found no graves newly dug, no blood, no bodies. But they did find one thing that troubled them deeply. Near the center of the village stood a cairn. a pile of stones marking what had once been a sacred burial site. The stones had been disturbed, shifted. Beneath them, the graves lay open. Not looted, just open. The Mounties wrote in their report that the earth appeared to have been moved by hand, not tool. And yet, the permafrost was hard as rock. It should have been impossible to shift. Still, the officers avoided speculation. They took photographs, measured the scene, recorded notes. When the northern lights flickered overhead that evening, even the most hardened among them grew quiet. Something about the place felt wrong. That night, as they camped near the lake's edge, the youngest constable, a man barely 20, swore he heard faint voices, like singing. He said they came from across the frozen water. The others heard only the wind. By morning, the tracks around their tents had vanished, erased overnight by a snowfall that none of them remembered hearing. They left soon after, shaken, carrying their notes back south to report. But the report never found its way into any official archive. Over the years, the story of Anjikuni became a whisper passed between trappers and pilots, a legend retold in the glow of northern fires. Some claimed the villagers had fled after a hunting accident or famine. Others said disease, starvation, madness. And some, the ones who had seen the lights dancing over that frozen lake, swore that the people of Anjikuni had been taken by the sky itself. For decades, no one returned. The place faded from maps, from memory. The nearest trading post stopped recording its name. But one year, many winters later, a government survey team, mapping the region for mineral deposits, stumbled upon the lake again. They expected nothing. Yet as they descended into the snow-swept basin, they saw the faint outlines of stone circles, collapsed igloos, and rusted tools glinting in the light. They noted something strange. The soil beneath the ruins was not barren. It was rich, almost fertile, as though something had once thrived there. A biologist among them suggested that perhaps the lake had shifted, flooding the area long ago, that the villagers had been forced to move suddenly. A rational answer, but that didn't explain the open graves, or the fact that the soil seemed newly disturbed, as though it had been turned only recently. The story of Anjikuni might have remained a northern legend if not for a photograph discovered years later in a private archive in Manitoba. A small, faded picture showing a group of Inuit families standing before their huts, smiling at the camera. Written on the back in careful handwriting. Taken at Anjikuni Lake, winter of 1929. It was the last known image of them. In the years that followed, more fragments surfaced. Letters from traders who spoke of sickness that spread through the region, diary pages from missionaries who mentioned a great silence among the people, and weather records noting one of the coldest winters in a century. The pieces never quite fit. Each account contradicted the next. But one detail remained consistent. The people of Anjikuni had disappeared, not over time, but overnight. And yet, if you ask those who still live near the old trapping routes, they'll tell you that on certain still nights, when the moonlight touches the lake just right, you can see shapes moving on the ice. Not ghosts, not spirits, but echoes of something that once was. They say the land remembers what the world forgets. That winter, the winter when an entire village vanished, marked the beginning of a silence that would take decades to understand. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, unwilling to fuel hysteria, quietly closed their files. The officers involved were transferred or retired. The notes vanished into drawers. The cairn at the center of the village was rebuilt by someone. No one knew who, and topped with a single smooth stone. Etched faintly into its surface was a symbol resembling a spiral. It had not been there before. In the decades that followed, as new settlements appeared across the northern territories, Anjikuni became a story told to children, a cautionary tale about listening to the land. But for those who knew the North well, the name carried weight. It was not simply a story of disappearance. It was a story of belonging, and of what happens when belonging is lost. Because beneath all the mystery, beneath the frozen silence, the vanished footprints, and the open graves, there was a simpler truth waiting to be found. That sometimes, a disappearance isn't about being taken. Sometimes it's about being unable to stay. And somewhere, under the snow, Anjikuni waited for someone who might finally understand why. The report of the disappearance spread slowly, as most northern stories do, carried not by newspapers or telegrams, but by men on sleds and the quiet mouths of travelers. By the time it reached Ottawa, winter had already sealed the territory beneath its glassy silence once again. The few officials who read the report debated whether to send a team back. Some called it hysteria, others an error of record-keeping. But one man, a senior field officer named Inspector Delaney, couldn't let it go. He had spent years posted in the north, and he knew the rhythm of life there. Villages didn't simply vanish. Not without reason. By February of 1931, Delaney and a small crew of Inuit guides set out across the tundra, retracing the trail toward Anjikuni Lake. The journey took 2 weeks. The land stretched endlessly, white and cruel. Winds that could flay skin, silence so vast it made a man question if he still existed. The guides rarely spoke. They seemed uneasy, whispering to one another in their language when the night grew long. Delaney caught fragments, words like spirit, ground, sorrow. He didn't press them. He understood enough to know that in the north, respect was a kind of prayer. When they reached the lake, the air was eerily still. The ruins of the village stood like broken teeth on the frozen shore. Delaney dismounted his sled and walked slowly through what remained. The igloos were collapsing under the weight of a year's snow. The entrance tunnels caved in. Yet the same traces of life lingered, bones of old fires, rusted tools, a child's carved figure half buried in the ice. He bent down to lift it. A tiny bird, wings outstretched. Its head had been chipped away, as if in haste. That small imperfection haunted him. His men set up camp on the lake's edge. The guides refused to sleep inside the old dwellings. They said it wasn't right. The village was not empty, only sleeping. Delaney spent that first night writing in his logbook by lantern light. His handwriting was careful, the words even. No sign of migration. No remains. Weather severe, but structures indicate sudden departure. Cannot explain condition of graves. Air heavy. Difficult to describe, as though sound itself has been absorbed. He closed the book, but sleep wouldn't come. The wind had stilled, yet he could swear he heard faint noises, like whispers carried from beneath the ice. The next morning, he ordered a search of the perimeter. The men found nothing unusual until one of the guides, an older hunter named Panic, called out softly. Delaney hurried over. There, half a mile from the village, the snow sloped down into a hollow where thin reeds poked through the crust. Beneath them, faint depressions in the snow, too shallow for footprints, too smooth to be animal tracks. Almost as if the snow had melted and refrozen in the shape of movement. Delaney crouched, brushing the surface. Beneath a thin layer of frost, something glittered. Piece of metal. He pulled it free. It was a small brooch, circular, carved with concentric rings. The center held a single piece of polished stone, pale as moonlight. He turned it over. There were initials scratched faintly on the back. AK. He brought it back to camp that evening, turning it in his hand by the firelight. One of the younger guides noticed it and went still. He said the design was not local, not from any of the tribes in that region. It resembled the work of coastal people hundreds of miles away. But the stone, the smooth, pale center, was not native to the tundra at all. Delaney pressed him for meaning. The guide hesitated, then said quietly, "It is a marker for remembering." Delaney wrote that down. He did not ask more. On the third day, they began to dig where the old cairn stood. The stones had shifted since the last mount of visit, as if someone had rebuilt it. Beneath the top layer, they found cloth. Animal skins wrapped carefully around something brittle. Delaney knelt and unfolded it with care. Inside lay bones, small, delicate, and arranged in a deliberate pattern. They weren't human, perhaps bird, perhaps fox, but they were laid out like a body. The guides backed away, muttering prayers. Delaney replaced the stones quietly. He didn't know what disturbed him more, the bones themselves, or the sense that whoever had done this was trying to send a message. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. Ice cracked on the lake like rifle fire. The aurora shimmered overhead, a green, soundless curtain. Delaney sat by the dying fire, writing. His logbook pages filled with sketches, the cairn, the brooch, the pattern of the graves. He was starting to suspect what might have happened, though he wasn't ready to believe it. Perhaps the people of Anjikuni had suffered an outbreak, disease, or starvation. Perhaps, fearing contagion or despair, they had performed a ritual of departure, leaving the bodies of their ancestors open to guide them. It wasn't abduction or mystery. It was sorrow, a choice made in silence. He wrote this theory, then crossed it out. Felt too simple, too rational for a scene that felt so deeply intentional. The next morning, one of the men was missing. His bedroll was empty, the flap of his tent open. They searched in widening circles until they found him near the frozen inlet, kneeling in the snow, staring at the horizon. His face was pale, eyes vacant. When they tried to move him, he resisted, whispering something in a language none of them understood. Panic translated softly. He says he saw them, the villagers, walking on the lake. Delaney looked out across the ice. The surface stretched unbroken for miles, smooth, untouched. He ordered the man returned to camp. By the next day, his fever had broken, but he remembered nothing. When the expedition ended, Delaney returned south. His report was long and restrained, written in the tone of a man struggling to hold facts steady against emotion. He concluded, "No definitive evidence of foul play or migration. All indications suggest sudden evacuation, likely due to famine, illness, or environmental collapse. Recommend no further investigation until spring thaw." The file was stamped, filed, and forgotten. But Delaney could not forget. Years later, long after he'd retired, he was found dead in his study, his notes scattered across the desk. Among them was a map, a hand-drawn sketch of Anjikuni Lake. Across it, he'd written a single line: "They followed the ice." No one knew what he meant. Decades passed. The north changed. Airplanes replaced sleds. The wilderness shrank. But the story of Anjikuni lingered, sometimes as a ghost tale, sometimes as a riddle. In 1954, a geologist named Margaret Hewson came across Delaney's original field reports while cataloging archives for a mining survey. Something about the phrasing caught her attention. The meticulous tone, the emotional restraint. She decided to visit the lake herself. Took 3 days by floatplane, 2 by sled. When she arrived, she found what generations of snow had left behind. The faint ring of stones, shards of pottery, traces of human life swallowed by earth. She took soil samples, photographed the site, and wrote in her journal that the area showed signs of sudden abandonment, consistent with famine conditions and resource collapse. But she noted something else, a pattern of charred lines beneath the surface, as if the ground had once been burned in long, sweeping arcs. Not wildfire, controlled, a deliberate act. Hewson stayed one night. As she prepared to leave the next morning, she noticed movement near the lake's edge. Not human, but the brief glimmer of light beneath the ice, like the reflection of something moving below. When she returned home, she filed her report, published one paper, and never went north again. But in her notebook, kept private until her death, she wrote a single passage. "The people of Anjikuni may not have vanished. They may have buried themselves in the lake, a collective act of grief or survival. The frozen ground could not take them, so the water did." Her words reignited interest in the mystery. Anthropologists debated whether it was possible, whether an entire community could choose disappearance as an act of preservation. Some argued it was metaphorical. Others saw it as literal, an exodus into the only element that could hide them from starvation, colonization, or despair. One researcher compared it to legends told among Arctic peoples, of those who walk into the ice when the world no longer has room for them. No one could prove it, but no one could disprove it either. By the 1970s, Anjikuni had become a kind of northern Atlantis, the story of a vanished village that seemed to absorb whatever meaning the listener brought to it. For scientists, it was about migration and adaptation. For locals, it was about memory and the price of forgetting one's ancestors. Yet for those few who had stood by that lake, who had felt its strange hush, the truth was simpler. The land had claimed back what was always its own. In 1981, a journalist named Paul Heston, researching myths of the Arctic, interviewed one of the last surviving trappers from the early era. The man was old, blind, and nearly toothless, but his memory was sharp. He said he'd known the people of Anjikuni. He said they'd been starving. The caribou herds had shifted, the fish had gone thin, and the cold had come early. The elders, proud and unwilling to beg from traders, made a decision. They would not die in their homes. They would leave the village together and walk across the ice toward the horizon, believing they would find a new shore when the thaw came. Heston asked him what happened next. The old man smiled sadly and said, "They became the lake." When Heston visited Anjikuni afterward, he found nothing but the same quiet. No bones, no huts, only the faint outline of old graves and the same cairn with its smooth, spiral-marked stone. He traced the spiral with his glove. The grooves were deeper now, as though time itself had been carving it. He wrote later in his article, "Perhaps the true disappearance of Anjikuni was not into the sky, but into history, into that soft place between what is remembered and what is no longer needed." As years turned into decades, the story changed shape again. To some, it was an unsolved mystery. To others, an act of quiet dignity. But those who have stood by that frozen lake know one unspoken truth, that in the far north, where survival depends on unity, sometimes disappearance is not abandonment. It's transformation. The land keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its children. The story of Anjikuni never really ended. It simply fell silent, buried under snow, like everything else that refused to decay. For most, it was only a myth whispered in trading posts or printed in the back pages of old northern almanacs. A curiosity, an empty village that might never have existed. But for a few, it remained an unfinished sentence, one that called softly across generations. In the summer of 1998, a research team from a small northern university returned to the site once more. The project was simple, a cultural mapping study of vanished Arctic settlements. The lead archaeologist, a quiet woman named Sarah Dufresne, had grown up hearing her grandfather's stories of the North. He'd been a fur trader in his youth, and sometimes, after too much whiskey, he would speak of the lake that swallowed a people. She never believed him, not entirely, but something in his voice, the way he grew quiet afterward, stayed with her. So, when the university's funding proposal landed on her desk, she volunteered. The helicopter dropped them on the southern edge of Anjikuni Lake. From above, the place looked ordinary. Just another stretch of tundra, dotted with black spruce and gray stone. The ruins were almost gone. A few mounds hinted at old dwellings, and the cairn still stood, half collapsed, its spiral stone now crusted with lichen. Sarah stood there a long time, the wind tugging at her parka. The air smelled faintly metallic, like frozen water. She knelt and touched the earth. It was soft, too soft for permafrost. Layers of dark loam mixed with sand, as though something had once been buried and then unearthed again. Her team began work immediately, measuring, photographing, cataloging. They found fragments: a bone needle, a child's bead, a shard of pottery shaped by careful hands. But nothing that answered the question of what had happened. That first night, Sarah sat alone by the lake. The others had turned in, their tents glowing faintly behind her. The sun, refusing to set fully in the northern summer, hovered low on the horizon. The lake gleamed like a mirror. She thought of the stories, of people walking out across the ice, of a choice made in silence. Could a whole community decide to vanish? Could despair become ritual? And if so, what were they leaving behind? The next morning, one of her assistants called out. They'd found something. A cluster of stones arranged in a perfect circle, half a meter below the surface. Inside the ring, the soil was darker, richer. Sarah knelt to examine it. The pattern reminded her of a hearth, though there was no sign of fire. Just layers of ash and bone dust, mixed so finely they were indistinguishable. At the center lay a smooth, pale stone, identical to the one found in the old brooch decades earlier. She brushed it clean, and as the sun hit its surface, faint etchings appeared. concentric rings spiraling outward. The same symbol carved on the cairn. She felt a chill, though the day was warm. One of the guides, an elder named Nanook, approached and stood beside her. He looked at the stone for a long time before speaking. "That," he said softly, "is a memory mark." Sarah turned to him. "What does it mean?" He hesitated. "It means they did not die. They returned to the land. They gave themselves back." That night, Nanook told the story as his grandfather had told it. Long ago, when the ice came early and the caribou did not return, the people of Anjikuni believed the world had forgotten them. Hunger had taken the children first, then the old. When no help came, the elders gathered the remaining families by the lake. They spoke of the spirits beneath the water, the ones who carried the dead to the next life. If they could not live, they would join them, not in despair, but in faith, a passage, not an ending. So they walked out, singing softly, until the ice took them. The lake froze over, sealing them within. "The land remembers," Nanook said. "It always remembers those who return willingly." Sarah didn't know what to say. Her rational mind, trained in science and evidence, rejected the idea. But her heart felt otherwise. The story was too quiet, too human to be dismissed. Over the next week, her team continued excavating. They found no bodies, no full remains. Only ash, traces of burned bone, and those same pale stones. The soil around the circles tested unusually fertile, rich with organic matter. It was as though the land itself had absorbed what once lived there. Sarah began to see a different picture forming. Not one of disappearance, but of transformation. The people of Anjikuni hadn't vanished. They had become part of the lake, part of the soil, part of the endless rhythm of freeze and thaw. Perhaps it had been an act of control, one final assertion of identity in a world closing in. To leave on their own terms. To let their memory feed the earth rather than fade into someone else's story. On her final evening, Sarah returned to the cairn. The light was low and golden, the lake a mirror of quiet. She placed the spiral-marked stone she'd found onto the cairn, beside the older one. For a moment, she thought she heard something. A low hum, faint and distant, like voices beneath water. But it was only the wind. Still, she whispered to the air, "I found you." Then she turned and began the long walk back to camp. Months later, when she published her report, it drew little attention. The world had grown louder, busier. Few cared about a village that had once existed beyond maps. But in her conclusion, she wrote something that lingered with those who read it carefully. Anjikuni may have been lost to time, but not to the land. The traces suggest an organized act of collective departure, a ritual grounded in ecology and belief. Their disappearance was not an erasure but a return. The people did not vanish. They became the place itself. Years passed. The research faded into archives, into footnotes. But sometimes, on sleepless nights, Sarah dreamed of that lake. In her dream, she stood on the ice at dawn. The air was clear, the light blue. Beneath the frozen surface, she could see faint shapes. Not bodies, not faces, but movements. The rhythm of life continuing, slow and eternal. When she woke, she always felt a strange peace. Today, nearly a century after that first cold night, when Joe Labelle stumbled upon an empty village, Anjikuni remains one of the Arctic's quiet mysteries. Some say it was famine. Some say migration. Some say a legend born from fear and misunderstanding. But for those who have walked that ground, who have felt the stillness that hums like memory, there is another truth. That sometimes a people do not vanish at all. They simply change form, become river, soil, wind. They live in the silence between words, in the snow that falls without sound. The land remembers them because the land is them. If you stand there now, on a still night when the northern lights drift like green smoke, you might hear it. A faint echo across the frozen water. Not sorrow, not haunting, just the quiet sound of belonging, returning home. And perhaps that is the real story of Anjikuni. Not a tale of loss, but of return. A reminder that even when the world forgets, the earth never does.